Today, I'm joined by Graham Linehan, author, writer, comedy writer. Everybody will know Graham from Father Ted and IT Crowd and a host of other comedy greats. And so I'm going to say, welcome to the UK column, Graham.
Hello. Well, nice to meet you, Mike.
It is fantastic to meet you. Now, it's very difficult to know exactly where to begin this, but let's just begin with Wikipedia. Wikipedia describes you as an anti-trans activist. Is that a fair? Would you consider yourself as being that these days?
No, that's how Wikipedia describes everyone who's concerned or fighting for women's rights. We've tried to change it a number of times, but the edit always reverts back within 15 minutes. And they use as their sources, stories that we've been trying. Like in my book, for instance, there was a story about me supposedly harassing a trans woman who was actually a convicted criminal who's changed his name 3 times. But these are the kinds of facts that the Guardian and Wikipedia leave out when they're talking about me. So, there's nothing I can do, really. I realized a few years ago that my reputation was in the hands of these people, and all I could do is just keep trying to get the word out about what I really believe. My views, which are often called anti-trans, are shared by many trans people, including Debbie Hayton, Miranda Yardley, Fionn Orlander, and more. And it's just a political weapon, calling someone anti-trans, because if you can't define the word trans, then the charge of transphobia just becomes a kind of all-purpose stick to hit people with.
What made you decide to speak out on this issue? Now, I noticed that the criticism that you originally had was over a particular episode of the IT Crowd, but it wasn't criticism. You didn't receive the criticism the first time that episode was broadcast. It was the second time the episode was broadcast. I think it was 2012 or so, if I'm right. Was that something that you were already, when you were writing that comedy show, were already thinking about, or was it just coincidence that sort of began a process?
It was just coincidence. The story actually came from the old sportscaster. You may remember him, Des Lynam, with the salt and pepper moustache, who apparently, there was a biography a trans woman wrote in which she said that she went on a date with Des and told him that she used to be a man, and Des just continued eating and shrugged, and it wasn't a problem to him. And I always found this extremely admirable, but also very funny, because it's a bit of a seismic thing to be told when you're having dinner with what you thought was a natural born woman. So I gave it to Douglas in my show, The IT Crowd, because I thought it would be a funny moment, and I just kind of extrapolated out from that a relationship between my character and the trans woman, and then when her past becomes too much for him to deal with, there's a huge fist fight because I wanted to film a Matrix type action sequence. I just did that and thought nothing of it. And there was a little bit of pushback, but I didn't quite register it at the time as being particularly vicious or strange. And it just kind of disappeared from my memory. But I think perhaps some trace of the pushback stayed with me, because I started looking into it. I started wondering, why are people getting so angry about this? Through my interest in it, I started learning about people like Julie Bindel, who'd been talking about it for, I think, a decade at that point, and had already been cancelled for it. Kathleen Stock, the people in Stonewall who had broken off and were worried about it. And I just started finding out more about it. And I knew that the cost was very high for entering into the debate with anything other than a completely cult-like attitude of trans women or women. But I let my guard down when I had an operation and I was on morphine. And unfortunately, I had my phone. And I sort of started thinking, why am I so worried about getting into this debate? It's a perfectly reasonable position to hold. and started talking about it. And almost instantly, I started getting threats. And one person, while I was still on the recuperating, one person tweeted, I wish the cancer had won. And ever since then, ever since that moment on my hospital gurney, I've been basically, fighting fires, as my reputation has been just completely traduced by these people. So, but I didn't enter into it. I had done the research. It was just a question of pulling the trigger. And when I did, I just started expressing the views that I had heard from all these different women who knew a lot more about it than I did, and who weren't being spoken to, who were being vilified as bigots. Kathleen Stock, I'm sure you remember, was hounded from her job at, I can't remember whether it was Sussex or Surrey University. I think it was Sussex. And the more I explored it and the more I was in this world, the more women I met who were being treated in the most disgusting fashion, who were losing their livelihoods, who were being threatened, being arrested in some cases. And the more I kind of found out about it, the harder it was for me to ignore what was happening to these women.
It's interesting what you say there, because somebody communicated with you while you're recovering from cancer, saying they wished you died.
Yeah.
You are putting forward a point of view with a view to having a rational discussion about something. You're then accused of being the hateful person, and yet you're in the receipt of comments like this, and everybody else has been commenting on this, is receiving the same type of communication back. My question is, where is the hate in this debate? It doesn't seem to be with the people that are actually wanting a rational conversation.
Yeah, it kind of expressed when you see the two phrases associated with each side. The other side, their kind of go-to was no debate, as if and this is something they've held on to. The very act of talking about this issue is somehow bigoted. Whereas our side has a phrase, let them speak, because we want people to hear trans rights activists. We want them to hear what they're advocating for and what their beliefs are. Because as soon as the general public finds out what they are, they reject it. To go back to its base and its beginnings, all this comes from a very good place. People are justifiably and rightly concerned about transsexuals and people with gender dysphoria, or actually I would call it more body dysphoria. People are rightly concerned. People want to do the best for anyone who's unlucky enough to be suffering from these conditions. But again, one of the things I discovered as I was looking this up is that a lot of the people who are calling themselves trans weren't trans at all. They were cross-dressing. They were, there's a famous couple who are on Only Connect who call themselves a queer couple. And it's because the husband wears earrings and the wife has short hair. Suddenly, you couldn't see the wood for the trees from the kind of people who are following a fad to actual transsexuals who were going through something pretty traumatic. And worse yet, all of society suddenly started colluding in not trying to combat dysphoria, but to encourage and implant it in people. The example of schools changing a pupil's name and pronouns without telling parents. These things were clearly wrong, clearly had nothing to do with transsexual people. And yet the response to even bringing up the issue was tweets like that one, I wish you had died, because this discussion is ring-fenced by incredible hostility, because the people behind it, they simply don't want the conversation to happen. And the best way they can ensure that is to try and abuse people, tie them up in employment tribunals, harass them with the police, harass them online, try and take away their platforms. They did everything in their power to try and make sure the conversation didn't happen. And I did. Sorry, I'm not sure. I sometimes I run on and I forget what the original intent of the question was.
No. I mean that's all absolutely fine. Now, Mike, let's come back though to sort of the beginning of your journey. I mean, why did you feel so strongly about this? What was it that really gripped you about it?
Oh, I was being called a bigot, and it wasn't true.
Why did you feel that this was something that you wanted to campaign about, or to get involved in the discussion at least?
Simply because women were being hurt, and simply because I seem to be unusual in that I don't need to see a woman raped in prison before I believe that men shouldn't be in women's prisons. You know what I mean? I don't need to see a child cutting off their breasts or their genitals and destroying their sexual function to know that that's a bad thing. Like these are all things. What I would flip the question in a way, and I would say, why isn't everyone fighting this? For me, this is one of the most appalling tragedies. That's certainly the most appalling tragedy that's happened to gay people since AIDS. We have multiple generations now of children who've been told, gay, gender non-conforming, who've been told that if they take puberty blockers, take cross-sex hormones, and have massive surgical interventions, then they will find their true selves. That's a horrific thing to tell gay people, a horrific thing to tell gay young people. And so I just didn't need to see all this play out to know that it needed fighting. And I'm still astonished that so many people seem to. We now have men and women in their 30s who are talking about how they didn't understand what they were getting into, how they had lots of psychological problems that weren't addressed, and they've all destroyed their bodies because they were encouraged to by what is essentially a cult. I just didn't need to see it play out to fight it, and I wanted to try and stop it before it affected more people.
Yeah. Two areas I'd like to look into with you. The first is schools, because you've mentioned schools already. Now, I've got two young adult children now that have been through the school system in Plymouth, and I know that a significant proportion of their colleagues, peers, experienced encouragement to consider what their gender was. The school absolutely respected any child that came along and said, please change my name on the register without telling the parents. You've already talked about that. And in fact, at one prom or formal event in the not too distant past, I know that there was indeed a queer couple that you've described. So a girl was considered herself a boy and a boy that considered himself a girl, and they were in a heterosexual relationship despite being the opposite genders than they actually were. So my question is, where is the sort of pressure on teachers coming, and why are teachers conforming with this and promoting this idea? I mean, actively promoting this idea in schools, do you think?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. That's one of the more puzzling ones for me, because I don't understand how any adult with children in their charge could put these, appall or encourage these ideas that have been, basically shared online through various different forums. Reddit, Tumblr is where a lot of this stuff grows, where a lot of kids are given the same kind of instructions on how to talk about this issue to people like parents and teachers. But it does surprise me that so many teachers were taken in by it. I went to meet a teacher in a school once, and they were working with an organization I thought were very troubling, called MAP. And at one point I said to the person who was very high up, like a assistant headmaster or something like that, I said, you don't actually believe that people can change sex, do you? And she said, well, I'm not a scientist. And that really terrified me, that uh, it just struck me as such an extraordinary thing to say. We've had however many centuries on Earth, and there's never been a movement like this. And to suddenly think that, there is such a kind of cohort of people called trans people uh, who need to have operations and need to uh, be addressed as she and her in order to be happy. I thought it was an extraordinary position for a teacher to take. Um, uh, but I think what it is probably, sorry, to go back to your actual question, I think the reason that teaching uh, has been captured to such an extent is, again, just because it's a middle class, it's a largely middle class career, and this is a middle class phenomenon. It's spread most amongst the middle classes. It's now being taken up by a lot of poor people, but it started off as a very kind of privileged belief system, and it's why it's taken over so completely in publishing, the media, theatre, and the arts. And I think, yeah, it's just basically it's spread via teachers, many of them who, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of it could be related also to teaching practices and to trying to be friends with your kids. I think a lot of adults who believe in this stuff, they often have kids who are telling them it, who are kind of feeding them a line that they've picked up from other people, and it kind of stems a little bit from wanting to be your kids' mates instead of wanting to be an adult and take care of them and make them make the right decisions. So I just think that, like, some professions are more susceptible to this than others, and unfortunately, teaching seems to be one of them. I don't have anything further than that on why it's particularly been captured.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I think it's almost like kind of a two-way grooming system where the kids are telling the adults these things, and the adults are telling the kids, and it creates a kind of an echo chamber of nonsense, with no one able to break through it, because the moment that, say, a teacher says, hang on a sec, this doesn't actually stand up, they're, hounded from their jobs. If a child says it, as happened in one school where a child questioned a member of the House of Lords who was promoting the ideology, she was spat on by her teammates. Spat on, surrounded, bullied. So it's got a high cost within schools of standing up to it. But unfortunately, everyone just wants to be a cool kid, including the teachers. So it's led to this. Again, just led to more confusion within schools.
Yes, I think you're onto something with the wanting to be mates issue in particular. There now,
Yes.
The other two areas you've already mentioned. One is prisons, and the other is sports, of course. And I'm sort of just left wondering what the motivation is for trans sports people, because I guess it is because men who are not good enough to be successful in men's sport are seeing opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, there's prize money to be had. There's, there's a weird kind of fame that they don't seem to mind having, which is a kind of a, oh, good for you. Good for you. It's all like they're disabled or something when they're actually stronger than the women that they're competing against, I think I think sports is what the sports issue has revealed is that, there's a line we have in society, and people who are opportunists in a predatory way are, that line stops those people from taking too much advantage of others. And what's happened with the trans issue is the line has been moved, and a lot of low-level, I would say, vaguely sociopathic men have decided what criminals decide all the time. which is, well, why should I follow these rules? I could make money if I pretend to be a woman and do this. Why should I do it? And I think that kind of low level opportunistic criminality exists in many of us. There's people. We often see people, cheating on their tax or whatever it happens to be. But if you give people an opportunity where they can cash in massively by cheating in such a way, they're going to do it. They're going to do it. It's like why wouldn't they? The criminal mindset doesn't go, oh, actually, it's wrong. I won't take this money. That's just lying there waiting for me. That's the criminal mindset just takes the money. So actually, it's an interesting story. I don't want to go too far off piste, but there's an interesting story I once heard that when policemen are looking for a criminal, let's say they don't know exactly where he is, but they know he's in a shopping center. The first thing they'll do is they'll check for his car registration in a disabled parking spot, because they'll find the disabled parking spots and they'll check there first, because apparently criminals love parking in disabled parking spots, because their attitude is, well, no, that's for suckers. I'm just going to park here. It's just free space. I'm not one of these suckers, And again, that's the mentality that is being catered to when you say, for instance, with a contact sport, hey, you're allowed now to fight women in the ring, and you'll get the normal prizes that are awarded to women who win these competitions. So I don't know, why wouldn't they take advantage of this? Why wouldn't they take these kinds of opportunities? What's been depressing is finding out quite how many men are happy to do it. It's a real kind of flaw in our sex that someone with a massive physical advantage is perfectly capable of not only taking advantage of it, but doing so, being photographed on podiums, smiling, as if they've achieved something. It's a pretty scary and depressing state of affairs when men are willing to do that, and it really doesn't. Again, it needs adults in the room, but again, it's so dangerous to be an adult in the room. You could have your life destroyed. Like, look at Stephen Nolan's podcast on Stonewall, and I remember thinking, I wonder how they'll get back at him. And of course, there was a few months later this concocted attempt to smear him as a bully or sexual offender, whatever it was. The costs for standing up and saying, hang on a sec, this bloke shouldn't be on a women's podium. What's he doing there? It's just too high. So, sports is an interesting one. And I think but the good thing about sports is that visually, it really makes our case, because suddenly everyone is realizing, as they see these photographs of winners' podiums, oh, okay, women are being completely, dominated in their own sports.
So, I mean, obviously you're familiar with the campaigns that are out there. And what's the situation? What is the situation with sort of women's rights campaigns and so on? Are they engaged actively in this topic? And to what degree? And to what degree are they being also cancelled?
Sorry, who do you mean specifically in this case?
Well, I don't really have anybody specific in mind. I mean, we obviously know the well-known personalities like Sharon Davies and J.K. Rowling and so on, and people like this. But there must be women's rights campaigns out there that have been campaigning for decades on equality for women and so on. Are they not getting behind you and others that are speaking out on this?
I see what you're saying. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the kind of established ones are what we call captured, which means that they have completely bought into trans ideology. The NWCI in Ireland is an example, I think. The over here we have the Women's Equality Party, which is again completely captured. There's a kind of mainstream feminism that's been rolling along introducing all these concepts in the most blasé and unthinking way. And yeah, they're kind of irrelevant now. The real organizations that are doing something and that are actually addressing this issue are groups like Sex Matters, the Women's Rights Network, Fair Play for Women, and the LGB Alliance. These are the groups that are actually trying to speak about it. But again, it's hard for them to get on TV. It's hard for them to be heard, because one of the kind of techniques that's used in this debate is simply pretending that there's no debate and pretending that these groups are irrelevant and have nothing to add and are TERFs. So yeah, that's another thing that I think is like the NWCI. They would never meet with a group like Sex Matters to talk about this, because they've been told and they believe that these women are bigots. So, and also I think they've just invested so much in this issue that any kind of climb down is going to be extremely embarrassing to them. So they're going to hold off that day for as long as they can. But to be very clear, these groups are betraying women. Like there's no excuse for standing by while a man like Barbie Kardashian was placed in a women's prison, a man who constantly talked about killing women, wanted to kill his own mother, and tore a social worker's scalp off, like part of a social worker's scalp off. This man was placed in Limerick Women's Prison. So any women's group that wasn't fighting this and trying to draw attention to it is, to my mind, not fit for purpose. They allowed these women to be put in danger to hold up a belief system that has no basis in reality and is simply a fad, a fashionable fad.
Let's move on to your own personal experience of what happened since you spoke out. So obviously, we have all followed your various Twitter bans over the last few years. And then, of course, there was the Edinburgh Festival and so on. But what about your personal connections and so on, your professional connections? How much of that has been damaged by what you've done, and how many people have stood beside you, as it were?
I think I can count them on half of one hand. Jonathan Ross stood up for me, and Richard Ayoade. And James Dreyfus. There's an actor I worked with once years ago, David Kahn from Brass Eye. He was very annoyed that I didn't mention him recently. But yeah, certainly on the fingers of one hand. Everyone else has distanced themselves from me, cut off communications with me, refused to engage with the issue. Most heartbreaking of all for me was my colleagues on the Father Ted musical, Arthur Matthews, Neil Hannon. They should have stood up for me. They should have said, hang on a sec, if Graham Linehan isn't doing it, then I'm not doing it. They should have said, Graham Linehan's not a bigot. What are you talking about? But none of them did. They just let me be kind of beaten up in the dark for over 5 years. So I've lost all my respect for people in the entertainment industry for the way that they have looked the other way while women's rights have just been kind of stolen in broad daylight, So even if I was allowed back, I'm not sure I would kind of want to. I don't know. I'm very disappointed by people. It's such a clear case of right and wrong. Just purely and a lot of the people who I'm talking about have daughters, and I just cannot understand why they're not standing up for their daughters. I met a woman the other day. Her daughter was a silver medalist national in jiu-jitsu and has had to leave the sport because of she's being placed. She's a young girl, still in school, but young boys were fighting her. So I don't understand. I simply don't understand how anyone with a daughter can look the other way as things like that are happening. And yeah, I don't know. Part of the problem is they don't want to talk to me. But the other part of the problem is I'm so disgusted with them, and the people that now I surround myself with. As I often joke, I used to know only people in the media, and now I know no one in the media. And, I'm friends with social workers and police officers and doctors and Tavistock whistleblowers and trans people and gay people, and no one in the media. So it's kind of good for good long term as a writer, but short term it's been very disruptive and strange. To be kind of spat out of a world simply because you were standing up for safeguarding.
Are you finding that the people that you are friends with now are better friends, perhaps?
Yeah, and they're all, as I said in the book, they're all brave. These are all people who stood up. They're all people who, many of whom have lost themselves, have lost friendships and relationships and work opportunities. I have a friend who used to teach autistic children. He made fun of that guy I told you about, who changed his name 3 times, the con man, who Wikipedia accuses me of harassing. And now he no longer teaches autistic children. They destroyed his career. They wrote to his accreditation body and destroyed his career. All to protect a commoner garden thug. So these are the people I admire, and the people who I'm friends with now, and I'm very proud to be among that community because they're genuinely brave and they took a stand when it was deeply unfashionable and deeply, detrimental to their careers.
Let's just talk about the book a little bit. So the book's called Tough Crowd, and I have read most of it now. I mean, in places hugely funny and enjoyable, and in other places, we absolutely get. And I see, I can see some emotion in what you're saying here. So I see how this really has impacted you personally, and that comes across in the book as well. So I think that but the book has gone quite well so far.
Yeah, it's doing okay. We got to the top 10 Sunday Times bestsellers, but it's still hard to find it in shops. Usually a top 10 bestseller would be piled high in places like Waterstones, but again, each different shop has a different power struggle going on between the people who want to sell books and the people who are essentially activists. And shop by shop, we're having trouble with displays and stuff like that, But luckily, my fans, my readers are writing in and telling me which shops are hiding it and which shops are stocking it.
This is what I wanted to get to, because obviously you'll have a fan base that has bought and read the book and has written to you about that. But obviously, since it is sold reasonably well, there must be people who have read it that are not necessarily familiar with your campaign, as it were. So what kind of response on a broader basis have you had to it so far?
Just very good, I mean, a lot. It was one of the reasons I wrote it. I wanted to show people what I've been through. I've been, I've really had no other means of doing so. Like on Twitter, for example, I have supposedly 500,000 followers, but I've been permanently shadow banned, which means that if you write a search for my Twitter handle, my troll impersonators come up before I do.
Yeah.
So I've just been kind of very deliberately silenced over the last few years. I kind of realized I needed a book to break it. So it seems to be having an effect. People seem to be realizing what I've gone through. But I don't know. It's for other people to tell me really whether it works or not, whether it's an effective story or not. I think the one good thing about the issue is that it did give me a good book. It gave me a good structure. Rise and Fall is a classic. story structure. So yeah, at least it gave me a book out of it.
I suppose you also recently attended the Tory party conference.
Mm-hmm.
How did that go?
Well, it was fine, but in the end, but originally I was refused accreditation, and we've sent the police, the Manchester police refused my accreditation, and I don't know why. So we're writing to the police and trying to find out exactly what communications passed between them and why that decision was made. But I can only imagine it's because of vexatious complaints from trans rights activists. So yeah, but eventually I got there and it was fine. I no longer have any kind of tribal prejudices. I judge people on their ideas and what they say. It's that simple. I used to be a lefty firebrand. In fact, I think it was one of the reasons why I was attacked so virulently was because I was a good little progressive. I believed all the same. I believed all the left wing positions sometimes without examining them. I'm ashamed to admit. And this experience has kind of made me rethink everything, and I no longer rely on other people to kind of get a sense of where I should go on a topic. If I comment on something, it's because I've read about it and I've properly examined it for myself. And if I had a flaw in the old days, it was too easily believing people who were in my tribe. That's gone. That's very much gone. And yeah, I spoke at a conservative fringe event where we just talked about these issues, and again met a bunch of extremely nice people. Yeah, I mean, as I use the Muhammad Ali line, the right never called me no bigot. You know what I mean? It was only the left that called me a bigot. So I'm happy to speak to the right.
Do you think there are any answers in politics and for this issue in this country at the moment?
Yeah, there's a few people who are standing up, but they're suffering hugely because of it. Rosie Duffield is the best example in the Labour Party. She should be head of women and equalities, but instead they're trying to deselect her. In fact, they're calling her anti-Semitic, which based on a tweet that I wrote about Eddie Izzard, where Eddie Izzard said, I have it memorized by now. He said, I'm a trans superhero, but in the old days, the Nazis would have hunted me down, something like this. And I replied, yes, the Nazis famously bigoted against blonde-haired, straight white men. And this has been used to accuse Rosie of anti-Semitism, whereas, of course, as you can hear, it's exactly the opposite. I was correcting some extraordinary Holocaust revisionism from Eddie Izzard. So, there are a few people who I admire in this. Rosie's one of them, waging a very lonely battle in the Labour Party. And on the other side, Kemi Badenoch, Cates, can't remember her first name, just jumped out of my head. Miriam Cates, is it? There are people out there who understand the issues and are communicating them brilliantly to the public.
I noticed those three that you've mentioned so far are all women.
Yeah, but there are some men, I think. I can't quite remember at the moment. In Scotland, there's a Neil, I think his name is something Neil. There are a few men around who are doing great. Sharar Ali of the Green Party is very good. But again, all of these people are tied up in, legal fights with like Sharar Ali, for instance, is currently involved in a legal fight with the Green Party because they don't like his gender critical beliefs. Everyone who speaks about this is just constantly tied up in some sort of legal action. because none of us like being called bigots, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a few people, but they're kind of lonely stars in the sky, in the night sky. You know what I mean? They're not getting a lot of support. So many politicians treat this as if it's just a toxic bin fire, which it is, but it will become less so if we have more mature people talking about it and trying to get to the nub of the issues that are, this is a whole wholesale kind of rejection of the safeguarding principles that the suffragettes won for women. And there's not yet been an explanation as to why they're being removed, as to why they're being attacked in this way. And politicians have been neglectful in not really treating this with the seriousness it deserves. I know so many people who've written letters to politicians that get ignored or get the same stock response about needing to be kind or diverse or whatever it happens to be, and they can't address the issues. They can't, whether it's some block they have or whether it's their advisors telling them not to comment on it, I don't know. But we've had a real problem with there being no adults in the room. And anytime an adult does stick their head up, the trans rights activists try and destroy their life.
We can't let you go, Graham, without speaking about Father Ted. But before we do, one aspect of that I would be quite interested to hear from you about was Father Ted, of course, we all know, absolutely making fun of the church establishment and so on. Did you not get any pushback at the time on that? Because obviously it became this massive thing, but in the early days, were you not getting some pushback on that?
Tiny bit of pushback at the very start, and a few uncomfortable priests along the way. I remember there was one priest who said that kids would call him Father Ted on the street, which was, I felt a bit guilty about. But generally, no. I mean, I've been to many weddings and occasions ever since where priests will approach me. One priest came up to me and he said something which blew me away. He said, "You haven't heard the half of it." I thought, what? Really? But yeah, I mean, it was the Catholic Church's hold over society was kind of coming to an end anyway, and then it was sped up by the Boston scandals. So we weren't really a huge concern, I think, to the Catholic Church at that time. We weren't really, causing much of a problem. And also, we were sort of careful to make the show not too cutting and satirical. It wasn't what we were interested in. We loved the characters and hanging out with them and watching them play board games and listening to the silly things they were saying. We didn't really want to take a sledgehammer to the Catholic Church. It never figured in my life, for instance, as a hugely relevant power. So we were going more by Arthur's uncles who were priests. At least one uncle was a priest, and we would just hear these hilarious stories about them. Arthur had great affection for them, and I'd never had any problems with priests. So we didn't want to write a savage show, and we had a commissioner who said, "You'll be all right as long as you don't attack central tenets of belief," and so we avoided that for the most part. So in the end, we had a show that you couldn't really protest against it because it would have been like fighting jelly. It was too silly to really be controversial, And again, and funny. Like, that's the thing. There's a line in a tape I heard about writing Seinfeld by the comedy writer Peter Melman, and he said, "Laughter is a very strong spice. So if you can make people laugh, then they'll forgive any kind of bad taste, But you have to make them laugh. That's the trick. If you don't, you just end up looking like a psychopath."
What role does laughter have in dealing with the types of issues we've been talking about today, or the other issues that we have? Is it possible to make a point through humor with these types of issues? And Mike, the reason I ask that question was 2008, financial crash and all that. I remember Rory Bremner Bremner Bird and Fortune did a series of satirical programs on the financial crash. And it occurred to me that actually in the process of producing those, the laughter was diffusing a lot of the tension and a lot of the anger and a lot of the pressure maybe to do something about the issue, and as a result we're basically back at square one again, where we're looking down the barrels of right. So my question about the role of humor is whether it has a useful purpose in these types of issues.
I do think it's useful. For me, the use comes from saying to an audience, "Hey, this thing. I think you've probably thought it too. You just haven't said it." And when people laugh, it gives them an opportunity to agree with the thing being said.
Right.
But I don't know. My problem with this particular issue that I'm fighting is that I think that the stakes are too high. The people who are are going through it are I don't find it funny. I like, children hurting themselves. It's not funny on any level. My my role at the moment, I see, is purely as an activist. I want to bring an end to that, as quickly as I possibly can. Maybe later it'll be possible to laugh about some aspects of it, but at the moment I think the stakes are too high for me to be able to fully relax to, for instance, address it in a sitcom. Also, I think that even if what you say is true, and those comedy routines slightly diffused people's desire to change something. Well, then I think that this issue won't be going on much longer, because it's like a pressure cooker. There is a huge desire to talk about it, a huge desire to kind of understand the issue, and it's being stymied by comedians, by journalists, by all manner of people who simply don't want anyone to address it in any way. So I think that what you were talking about, where that situation was, or the search for a solution was slightly undermined by comedy, I think the opposite might be the case here, where the absence of any comedy about this issue means that it can't go on much longer without people blowing a gasket. I long for the days when the stakes aren't so high, and we can go back to laughing at each other and laughing at the silly things that make us human. But it's not here yet,
Well, Graham, I'm going to say thank you very, very much for that today. Now, how do people follow you, aside from Twitter, which you somehow are still on? Is there anywhere else? And of course, to buy the book. I would encourage everybody to buy the book, but where else can people follow you?
Well, I have a website called the Glinner Update, which regularly publishes the kind of people I've been talking about today, the people who've been fighting all this stuff. I occasionally write stuff for it myself when I'm not doing publicity for the book, as I am at the moment. But yeah, that's the best place to find me. And if you take out a paid subscription, that's really my only form of income at the moment. So apart from the book, of course. So yeah, if that's where to go, the Glinner Update.
Okay. Well, Graham Linehan, thank you very, very much for joining us today. That has been really interesting. Hopefully we'll speak again very soon.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.